There is a specific kind of terror that nobody warns you about, not the terror of failure, not the terror of rejection, not even the terror of loss in the way most people understand loss: someone leaving, something ending, a door closing that you wanted to stay open. This terror is quieter than all of those, more intimate, more disorienting, because it doesn't come from something happening to you from the outside. It comes from something dissolving on the inside. And what is dissolving isn't your worst self, isn't your limitations, isn't the parts of you that you've always wanted to be rid of. What is dissolving is everything you've ever called yourself. Carl Jung spent decades sitting across from people who were in the middle of this exact experience. People who had begun, sometimes intentionally, sometimes without choosing it, the process of becoming who they actually were. And what he observed, with a consistency that eventually became one of the cornerstones of his entire psychological framework, was this: the process of becoming yourself does not feel like becoming. It feels, for a long and terrifying stretch, like disappearing. Most people who encounter this experience do not have language for it. They know something is happening. They know the person they used to be is no longer quite fitting the way it used to. Old certainties are losing their solidity. Things that used to matter deeply are starting to feel hollow. Relationships that once felt essential are beginning to feel constraining. The life they built carefully, effortfully, in ways that made complete sense at the time is starting to feel like a costume they're not sure they ever actually chose. And rather than recognizing this as the most important thing that has ever happened to them, they conclude that something has gone terribly wrong. Jung had a name for what was happening. He called it individuation. And he was careful, always, to be honest about what it actually involved, because individuation, the process of becoming the person you most essentially are, stripped of everything the world conditioned you to perform, is not a gentle unfolding. It is not a gradual, comfortable expansion into a more authentic version of yourself. It is, at its core, a series of losses, real losses. Losses that hurt with the full weight of genuine grief. And understanding why those losses are not only inevitable but necessary, that is what most people who are living through this desperately need and almost never receive. The first thing you lose when you begin to become yourself is certainty. Not the certainty of facts or information, the deeper kind. The certainty of knowing who you are in relation to everything around you. The stable sense of self that most people carry through their daily lives without examining. The one that tells you what you believe, what you value, what kind of person you are, what you want, what you would and would not do. That sense of self feels, before this process begins, as solid and reliable as the ground under your feet. You don't notice it until it starts to shift, and when it starts to shift, the disorientation is profound in a way that is almost impossible to communicate to someone who hasn't felt it. Jung observed that this destabilization was not a malfunction. It was the process working exactly as it was supposed to, because that stable sense of self, the one that is now dissolving, was never actually you. It was the self you assembled in response to your environment. The self that was shaped by what your family needed you to be, what your culture rewarded, what your early experiences taught you was safe and what was dangerous, what earned love and what risked its withdrawal. This assembled self is not false in the sense of being a deliberate deception. You built it genuinely, out of genuine necessity, and it served real purposes. But it was always a response to external conditions, rather than an expression of internal truth. And at a certain point in development, not the same point for everyone. Triggered by different things in different people, the psyche begins to push towards something more real. Something underneath all the assembling. That push is what individuation is, and the assembled self, the one you've called yourself for your entire life, does not yield without a fight. The second loss is harder to talk about because it involves people you love. When you begin to change in the ways that genuine individuation requires, the people around you do not all celebrate it. Some do. But many, particularly the ones who are most intimately connected to the version of you that is dissolving, experience your transformation as a kind of threat. Not necessarily consciously, not with malicious intent, but the system of relationships you exist within has been calibrated to the person you were. The roles you played, the needs you met, The ways you made other people feel comfortable and safe and understood, all of that was predicated on you remaining recognizably yourself. When you stop being that person, the system experiences disruption. Jung documented this with a clarity that felt, to many of his patients, like both validation and devastation simultaneously. The people who love you may begin to tell you that you've changed, as though change is the problem. They may express concern about decisions you're making that feel, from the inside, like the first genuinely free decisions you've ever made. They may pull harder toward the version of you they knew, with more emotional intensity than you expected. Because your changing is surfacing their own unexamined relationship with who they've allowed themselves to be. And this is where the terror deepens. Because you are now in a position where becoming yourself more completely means, in some cases, disappointing people you love. It means outgrowing dynamics that once felt like home. It means that some relationships, not because anyone is villainous, but simply because of the honest mathematics of who people are and who they're becoming, will not survive the transformation intact. Jung was not romantic about this. He did not suggest that love conquers all developmental differences, or that authentic relationships should be able to accommodate any amount of change without difficulty. What he observed was more honest and more difficult than that. Becoming yourself sometimes costs you the version of your relationships that was built around the self you're leaving behind. And that loss is real. It deserves to be grieved fully, not minimized in the name of growth. The third loss is the one that tends to arrive last, and it is in many ways the most disorienting of all. It is the loss of your story. Every person carries a narrative about who they are. This narrative is not simply a record of what happened to them. It is a meaning-making structure, a way of organizing experience into something coherent and interpretable. It tells you why you are the way you are. It explains your choices, justifies your defenses, makes sense of your relationships and your patterns. It gives you a position in the world: protagonist, survivor, seeker, healer, the one who overcame, the one who was wronged, the one who understands. This story is not nothing. It is, in fact, one of the most fundamentally human things about you. The capacity to organize experience into narrative is part of what makes consciousness what it is. But Jung noticed that the story, as much as it served the person carrying it, also imprisoned them. Because the story required consistency. It needed the future to resemble the past in order to remain coherent. Every new experience got processed through the existing narrative, rather than being encountered fresh. And the self defined by the story could not grow beyond what the story permitted without the story itself beginning to fracture. When individuation is genuinely underway, the story begins to fracture. The meaning-making structure that has organized your entire experience of being alive starts to become inadequate to what you are actually living. And without a story that holds, without a coherent narrative about who you are and why, the disorientation is existential in the most literal sense. You are not just confused. You are, for a time, genuinely without a foundation. Jung called this the dark night of the soul, borrowing language from the mystics because he found that their descriptions of this experience were more accurate than anything clinical language could offer. The dark night is not depression, though it can look like depression from the outside and can feel like depression from the inside. It is a specific kind of emptiness that arrives when the old self has become insufficient, but the new self has not yet formed. It is the void between who you were and who you are becoming, and it has no floor you can find, and no ceiling you can touch, and no walls to orient yourself against. Most people who arrive here are certain something has gone catastrophically wrong, because everything they have been taught to interpret as signs of a good life, clarity of purpose, confidence in identity, stability in relationships, a coherent sense of direction has temporarily vanished, and nothing has arrived to replace it yet. Jung's most important contribution to understanding this experience was insisting, with the full weight of his clinical observation, that the void is not the problem. The void is the process. The emptiness is not evidence that something has broken. It is evidence that something is working, that the self which was assembled from the outside in is finally giving way to the self that has been waiting, sometimes for decades, to be built from the inside out. He used a specific word for what lives in that void, waiting to organize consciousness in a new way. He called it the self-capitalized to distinguish it from the ego self that most people experience as their identity. The self in Jung's framework is not a constructed thing. It is not assembled from external feedback or shaped by the approval of others. It is the totality of who you actually are, including everything the ego rejected as unacceptable, everything the persona hid as unseemly, everything the wound identity could not afford to acknowledge. When the constructed self releases, when you stop holding the assembled version of yourself together through sheer force of habit and the exhausting maintenance of consistency, the self begins to surface. And the self, Jung observed, is not fragile in the way the constructed self is fragile. It does not need external validation to remain coherent. It does not require the approval of others to know what it values. It does not collapse when challenged, because it is not organized around the opinions of people who might withdraw their regard. But the emergence of the self is not instantaneous, and it is not painless. It requires, as its precondition, the full surrender of everything you've been using as a substitute for it. And that surrender is what feels, from the inside, like losing everything. Because you are losing everything. Everything constructed, everything performed, everything maintained, everything that was you in the way that the world understood you to be you. What you are not losing, though it will not feel this way during the process, is yourself, the actual self, the one underneath all the layers of response and adaptation and careful management of others' perceptions. That self is not being destroyed, it is being uncovered, but uncovering requires removal. And removal, when what is being removed is the entire architecture of your identity, feels indistinguishable from destruction while it is happening. Jung noticed something specific about the people who moved through this process without turning back. They shared a particular quality that he came to regard as the single most important predictor of whether someone would complete individuation or spend the rest of their lives circling its edge without entering. He called it the willingness to not know. Not the intellectual acceptance of uncertainty, which is relatively easy to perform. The actual embodied, sustained tolerance of not knowing who you are, what you want, where you're going, what you believe, what your life is for. The ability to remain in the question without forcing an answer, to stay in the void without reaching for the first available story to fill it with, to resist the enormous psychological pressure, internal and external. To resolve disorientation by simply reconstructing a new version of the old self and calling it growth. This willingness is rare. It is rare because everything in human psychology and human culture conspires against it. We reward certainty. We pathologize confusion. We interpret not knowing as a problem to be solved rather than as a threshold to be inhabited. And so most people, when they arrive at the edge of genuine individuation, find a way to turn the experience into something more manageable. They reframe the dissolution as a breakdown to be recovered from. They reconstruct a new identity that incorporates the language of transformation without undergoing the reality of it. They become, in the vocabulary of their particular community, someone who has done the work, and they are more articulate and more self-aware than they were before. But they have not become themselves. They have become a more sophisticated version of the self that was always performing. The people who stay in the not knowing, who tolerate the void without filling it prematurely, what emerges for them is something that Jung found genuinely difficult to describe in clinical language. Because the person who comes out the other side of full individuation does not map neatly onto the psychological categories he had developed for people who had not gone through it. They are quieter than before, not withdrawn, not diminished, but quieter in the specific way of someone who no longer needs the external world to confirm their internal reality. They have access to a stillness that is not performed and cannot be disrupted, because it is not built on any condition that could be removed. They are fully present in a way that is palpable to everyone around them. Because they are no longer partly somewhere else managing their image, monitoring others' reactions, maintaining the performance of whoever they had decided to be. They have also, and this is perhaps the most important thing, developed an entirely different relationship with loss itself, having passed through the loss of everything they called themselves, and discovered that they did not disappear, that something remained, something more essential and more durable than everything that dissolved. They no longer fear loss with the same existential intensity. Loss still hurts, grief still arrives, pain is still felt fully. But underneath all of it is a knowledge that was purchased at the price of genuine dissolution, that what is most essentially you cannot be taken, it can only be covered. And you now know with a certainty that no argument can touch how to uncover it. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation as the purpose underlying all of psychological development. Not the achievement of happiness, not the resolution of suffering, not the construction of a successful life by any external measure, the arrival, through whatever losses it requires, at the self that was always there, the one that was never assembled and therefore cannot be dismantled, the one that has no performance to maintain and therefore cannot be exhausted, the one that needs nothing from you except, finally, your willingness to stop being everything else long enough to be it. The process of becoming yourself feels like losing everything because you are losing everything that was standing between you and yourself. And on the other side of that loss is the only thing you were ever actually looking for, not certainty, not stability in the way you used to need it, not the approval of people who loved the version of you that no longer exists. Something quieter than all of those things and more durable than any of them. The experience of being fully, irreversibly, finally home in yourself. Jung watched it happen again and again, in person after person willing to go all the way through rather than finding a way around. And every single time, without exception, the same thing emerged from the far side of the dissolution. Not a person who had lost everything. A person who had finally found the one thing that all the losing had been clearing space for. Themselves, completely, without remainder, without performance, without the exhausting maintenance of a self that was never really theirs to begin with. That is what is waiting on the other side of the terror, not the absence of loss. The end of the fear of it,